let's go ahead and get started. Sorry, we're starting a little late. So we have about, looks like 20 minutes to talk about building a web app for data exploration with smart mapping. My name is Christian Ekenis. I'm a product engineer in the JavaScript API, and smart mapping is one of the projects I work on. I tend to work on pretty much everything visualization, mostly 2D, also 3D. So if you have any questions regarding the renderers or visualization or smart mapping, you can come find me at the JavaScript island and ask. Just to start off, how many of you guys have used or feel like you're familiar with smart mapping already? Okay, so 1.5. So before we really jump into what smart mapping is, I'm just going to briefly give you this one slide on visualization in the JavaScript API. It's a lot more than this, but this sums it up. So in the 4x version, you can set renders on a feature layer, scene layer, map image layer, CSV layer, and basically create data-driven visualizations. So you might have a service layer that contains a field or a set of fields, and you want to drive the visual. And what I mean by drive it, what I mean is you query for the data, and then you map a visual variable to that data value. And that could be unique value rendering, it could be class breaks, or in the case of this one, it's a continuous color ramp. So if you take a look at it, you have a set of stops. So these are earthquakes, by the way. And if you notice, there's a field magnitude. So the stops indicate that if an earthquake is magnitude 2.0 or smaller, you give it this pale yellowish color. And if it's 7.5 or higher, you give it a deeper purple color. And all the other values in between 2 and 7.5 are interpolated and along that color ramp, so they're assigned an appropriate color. So as you can see with that text there, visualization is hard. You might look at this API and say, well, this is simple syntax, but I'm not a cartographer. I don't understand which color schemes make the most sense for my map. I don't understand which colors look good, and I don't even know what data values to map to them. And that's where smart mapping, that's where that project was really born. It came from the idea that you don't always know what your data looks like. A lot of you have data sets that you're very familiar with, but there might be data sets that come in and you're like, I don't know what this field is, and I just want to explore it. And so smart mapping really aims to give you a good starting point for exploring your data and for ultimately visualizing it. So I want to emphasize that kind of throughout this demo theater, that smart mapping, it's not intended to give you the best visualization right away. It's supposed to give you a very good start, though. So in these images, let me go back really quick. So you can see that smart mapping talks, like we deal with types in the case of that colorful image up there. And if you rotate clockwise around, you have colors and sizes of icons. That's a multivariate visualization. Then you can also rotate icons. You can just apply size and apply colors. You can do all sorts of things. Now, one of the key components of smart mapping is having a good set of color schemes. This is just a very small subset of what we have, but I just want to divide them into different themes. So we have high to low themes, extremes, so maybe you only care about the top and the bottom ends of your data. Centered on, you might just center on a particular value, and that's all you care to visualize. And then above and below, that tends to be my favorite. You might have a midpoint, maybe it's the national average of whatever demographic you're measuring, and you want to see what's above and below that. So this is the last slide I'll show you before we jump into demos. The workflow for smart mapping is basically this. You start off with data, and it could be any one of these layer types. It could even be data that's not a hosted ArcGIS service. But the point is, once you have that data, you need to get it into the form of a layer. Obviously, if you're working already in the ArcGIS platform, this workflow is going to be much easier. If you have data that's outside the platform, you can do things with it to make it follow the proper schema. So you can take advantage of smart mapping. But all these demos are going to show ArcGIS services. So basically what smart mapping, what we have in the API are these ideas of render creators or generators. So rather than bringing in a module such as a simple render or a unique value render, we're going to create one for you. And you have a set of parameters. That's what the first purple box is. So the primary parameter you have is a layer. And then you're going to have a base map. The reason the base map is important is because it allows us to tell you which color scheme is going to work. If you have a dark base map, certain colors simply aren't going to look good. If you have a light base map, other colors are going to look good. So we have a different set of schemes for each base map. So we're very, very intentional when it comes to selecting a proper color scheme for you. And then, of course, a field name or arcade expression. We're not going to get too deep into arcade because we just don't have enough time. But you basically provide a field value, and then what the render creator will do is it will query for the stats on the server, and then it will take a look, get that optimal color scheme based solely on the base map, and then it will map those data values to your colors. So it generates a renderer, and then you can take that render object and apply it back onto your layer. So in the case of this visualization, these data points are precipitation points, but on their own, you see they're just black dots. That doesn't mean anything to us. We just see where it rained. We don't know how much it rained. But if we want to see how much, you can just throw in this, it looks like, it says glob value, but it could be like global value. But that indicates the precipitation amount. And so it'll return this render that gives you something that looks like that. It's a good starting point, but it may not be what you want to end up with. So let's dive into some apps. Just got a few minutes, so like I said, we can't get into all the details, but hopefully you get a sense of the simplicity of the API for smart mapping. So let's switch over to my browser. Let's see here. Okay. So I just want to show you really quick. There's a couple of places you can read in the documentation about this. There's a visualization tab here in the guide. And in the visualization overview, you can read about the smart mapping APIs here. And you'll see these render creators that I just mentioned. If you click on there, it'll direct you straight to the API reference, so you can see where each of these render creators is applicable. So with that, I wanted to show you also that if you click the sample code tab in the documentation and you search for smart mapping, all one word, you'll get these 7 results for smart mapping. All of these demonstrate these render creators. So we have a class breaks visualization. So for those of you GIS nerds, that's like the natural breaks, equal interval, manual breaks, and the other classification schemes. Smart mapping will help generate those for you based on your data. There's the case of multivariate, so you can drive size and color at the same time, or just continuous color. There's 3D apps. I'm going to show you one 2D and one 3D. But let's just take a look at this sample really quick so you get a feel for what this looks like. So here I have my parameters like I showed you before. You have a layer, set the base map, and then you indicate a field. And in the case of a lot of your visualizations, you're going to want to normalize your data, especially if it's a total count, such as population. So the total population and poverty, normalized based on the total overall population. Then if you give it that nice above and below theme, all you do is you pass those parameters in that create continuous renderer method, and then you're going to get a response, and then you set that back on the layers render. That's really all there is to it. It's a pretty slick and simple API. But again, this is something that you may not want to use in all your apps, and I'll explain why in just a sec. And then there's also the statistic functions, such as histograms. And the histogram allows you to visualize your data along a histogram and append it to this slider widget. So if I look in the sandbox, I'm bringing in my smart mapping modules. So first of all, the color creator module, and then the histogram statistics module. And I just set up a standard map with a feature layer. There's my color parameters, and I also have slider parameters for setting up my slider. Pass those in there, and then we set the render back on the layer. And notice here in the histogram, I use pretty much the same thing. But I can also, if I want to make this, say, finer detail, this histogram, I could set the number of bins to 30. Right now, the default is 10. So I get this nicer looking histogram. And the slider widgets, you have 3 widgets that we currently support. There's the color slider, which is this one, a size slider, and then one that's called the univariate color size slider. And the reason why we call it that is because it's really intended to work for both color and size on the same variable. But as you move the slider, the visualization will automatically update. And you do that by listening on this event, clone your render, and set the new visual variable on the updated slider. So let's take a look at this application. This one I did a couple months ago. It's pretty basic. I just throw in a layer of counties, and then I put in these 2 drop-down menus. So I can say, this is election data. So let's say I look at the percentage of the population who voted for President Obama. Looks like we have a tile caching issue here on these edges. But percent of the population who voted for Obama. And then, as you can see, I get my nice histogram. I get the render, looks good. Note that I can change my theme, so I can get a different visualization centered on. I don't know if it makes sense here, but you can have a high to low, which is what it defaulted to before. There's above and below. And of course, I can change it to a different attribute, percent who voted for Romney. And then if I wanted to make this multivariate, I can make these icons and size them, maybe based on the unemployment rate. And so it'll automatically generate those sizes for me. I don't have to know the pixel size for each of these. I don't have to know my data. I don't have to know what the unemployment rates are for each. I just pass in that value to the method, and it will take care of all of that for me. So this is what it looks like in code. I have my options. I'm just grabbing the value of my field select. And then I'm throwing it in this function that I called getColorVisualVariable. You'll notice that I'm not calling the createRenderer function. Well, I'm actually calling it here, but in the case of the size, I'm calling the getVisualVariable or createVisualVariable, which is also in the API. And it's just following that exact same pattern that I was showing you before. I pass in those parameters to this method, and I set that renderer back on the layer right here. And then, of course, I can set my histogram. And when I do that, I can update the histogram on my slider. And when the slider is updated, which is the case here, I can clone the visual variable or the visual variables on the, in this case, I'm cloning the visual variables on the render because I might want to keep one. If I want to keep the color visual variable, then I want to clone them, make sure I have it, and then I can update the size one. Sorry, I'm blowing through this really fast. We just don't have a lot of time. I debated on whether I should show you this one or not because I don't want to mislead you in any way. So we also support smart mapping in 3D. And that means, you could interpret that a couple of ways. For example, in the documentation, we have smart mapping for buildings. So it's the exact same pattern I showed you, except you can apply it to your scene layer of buildings. And if these load, there we go. You'll see that they are assigned a render. Or it could be for points that are basically have, they look like columns that are extruded at a certain height, and you can change them with this slider. I believe this is total population. But then what I really think is powerful about 3D is really the 2D visualization, but in 3D space. And what I mean by that is this data that I am showing you here is actually 2D data. I'm placing these points at an offset from this bathymetry service based on an attribute field. So it's not really an XYZ point location, but it's really good ocean data. It's ecological marine units. you can actually download this for free on Esri's website, or if you just do a Google search for EMUs or ecological marine units, it'll come up. It's got all sorts of great data. You can look at all these different variables in the ocean. So this is the Maldives, and I'm looking at salinity right now. And so here I can change my color slider and see how the pattern changes in 3D space. And what's cool about that is you can't really get that dimension in 2D. So if I change my view here, you'll notice how the pattern changes in 3D. So you see how it kind of goes one direction, then loops, switches back, and as you get deeper from the surface. That's something you can't see in 2D right away. So when I mess with this visualization a little bit and explore it, I would have to use some kind of depth slider in 2D, but even the depth slider can be misleading. So if I show you this quick video. So this is what I was referring to. The fact that if you look up, it's kind of hard to see, there's this black line off to the right here. That's a depth slider. So I'm just looking at one attribute and moving that depth slider down. So each frame of this animation is just one depth level that I'm looking at. And as you can tell, it's hard to actually see what's going on in 3D there. You can also visualize it with not just icons, but tubes, such as the case in this visual. So without the slider, now I can see in 3D space the variation that exists at the different depths. So you see in the XY space, I see how the salinity varies from east to west and north to south, but I also see how it varies from the surface and down to the seafloor. And that's pretty cool because you can see in some pockets there on the surface in this top corner where it is very low salinity, then all of a sudden, as you get deeper, it's very high, and then it gets low again. It's just something that's fascinating to me. And if I change to, say, a centered on theme, I can just look at where everything is the same at one particular value. So I'm just changing the value and seeing how it varies along at various depths. And it's, again, fascinating how you can see it slide across the top and the bottom at the same time as it goes from east to west and down at the different depths. So we just have 3 minutes. Let me, let's see, open up the code for this one. What I meant by I don't want to be deceiving with that one is in those visuals that I showed the video of, we don't technically allow that much data in the scene view in 3D. We limit you to, I believe, 16,000 points, and that's showing something like 64,000. We will get there. I do have this app live on my GitHub repo, which I'll show to you right now. So you can take a look at it. It's right here. If you go to GitHub, this is my user account, and then this conferences repo, you'll find all my stuff for this Dev Summit. So go to DS 2018, smart mapping, that's what's in this session. I didn't show this Mexico demographics app, so I'll update this. But all these demos are in this folder here. But anyway, I use some kind of hack to allow you to override the max in there. I don't encourage you to use it, but because it's Dev Summit, why not? And anyway, we're out of time. But I want to make time for a couple of questions, and certainly if you have use cases or have something you're curious about, by all means, bring it up and let's talk about it. So, any questions? Feel like I just blew through it really fast, and I did. It's just, I could talk about this for hours, and 20 minutes really isn't a lot of time. But certainly, you're welcome to come by the island. I've seen some of you do some interesting apps with this before, so I'm curious to see if you've come up with anything new. So thanks for coming.